On behalf of the Department of Africana Studies at Georgia State University and the Auburn Avenue Research Library, we welcome you to the first installment of our Freedom School lecture series. We had a great run of them in 2020, and so now in 2021, we want to continue this series, and we're in for a special treat this evening. The topic for today is abolishing state violence and remaking community safety, a conversation with Attorney Tiffany Roberts. And before we move right into it, let me just state the purpose of this topic tonight and this forum tonight is really comes from last summer when our people were in the streets protesting and in resistance to the killing of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Rashad Brooks, the assault on the Morehouse and Spelman student who were trying to get home after curfew. All of these occurrences that occurred last summer, and that in that light, Black faculty on campus wanted the university to take a special look at this whole question of policing, because Georgia State is supposed to be committed to dealing with and finding solutions to some of the most pressing problems of cities, and certainly the killing of Black people, the police repression of Black people, the state violence against Black people, we know is a pressing problem. So we decided to bring not only the focus on that, we plan to have a conference later this year and we'll be giving information on that, but we wanted to bring not only one of our best minds to talk and have conversation with on this issue, but we also wanted to bring on not only somebody been thinking about it, been doing something about it. And so that's why we asked Attorney Tiffany Roberts to come on. Before we start, one of our colleagues lost her son last Sunday. Young brother Rodney McBride passed. And so we just want to take a few seconds out for a moment of silence in the honor of this young brother, in the honor of, you know, the lives that have been lost this year, not only to COVID, but to state violence. Ashe. So at this time, I want to introduce the folk who will be driving this conversation forward. First, I want to introduce Professor Kenda Abdus-Saboor. Kenda Abdus-Saboor will be our moderator and discussing tonight. She is a lecturer in the College of Law, Georgia State University, where she is responsible in the College of Law and sits on the faculty of the externship program. The externship program is the one that prepares our law students really to go into the field, to help them know what being a law professional is really about. And so she has an important task there. She's practiced domestic law, as well as she is a graduate of Emory Law School. She will be the person driving the conversation with our, I should say, I almost want to call her one of our activists in residence. Like we should give her that official title one day. But it's Attorney Tiffany Roberts, who is a criminal and civil rights attorney. She's the Community Engagement and Movement Building Counsel for the Southern Center for Human Rights. She is a founder of Black Lives Matter Atlanta and an advocate for police accountability and social justice. And that's, what's on her bio, but I've actually seen Tiffany in action. And she's not only an advocate for our people from the legal front, but she's a leader for our people and knows how to speak, inspire, and counsel folk. And so with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Kenda, attorney, and Professor Kenda Abdus-Saboor, and hear this amazing conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody who has joined us this evening. I know it's Friday evening. So thanks for spending your time here with us this evening for what promises to be hopefully a very insightful and timely conversation. As he was saying, what really is bringing this to the forefront, these issues, which have been very pressing issues, right, for a long time, but in the past year have really been brought to the forefront by, people protesting in the streets and repeated unarmed killings of unarmed Black people. And so we're hoping today to really shed some light on these issues, to have a conversation, to dig deeper into not just the issues in and of themselves, but hopefully some solutions. Tiffany, I'm really excited to share this platform and this conversation with her. She's a treasure. I have the joy of working with her at Georgia State, and she's truly a treasure to our GSU community and the Atlanta community as well. So I'm looking forward to that conversation. I did want to just logistically kind of just let you all know the lay of the land for this evening. So Tiffany and I will talk for a bit, just her and I just kind of having a conversation, unpacking our theme, which is this notion of abolishing state violence and remaking community safety. And then we'll open the chat for questions. So I know we have some people on Facebook and we have some people who have joined us via Zoom. And so whichever platform you're on, hopefully your questions will get to me one way or the other. So you can just send your questions. So you send your questions that way. Okay. So with that being said, we are going to go ahead and get started. And, as I thought about what a great place to be to start the conversation would just be talking about this foundation of what this term of state violence is, right? Like what actions we're actually referring to, what actors we're referring to. So Tiffany, the first question I want to start with is, what do we mean by that? Like, what do we mean by this notion of state violence?
Sure. And I echo your sentiments. Thank you so much for having us. I'm so excited really to have this conversation with people that I respect so much. And when we talk about state violence, I think sometimes we get locked into a box of talking only about police killings. And we don't think broadly about the ways that the state enacts violence or permits violence on marginalized populations. In this conversation, of course, we will focus mostly on the disproportionate impact of state and state-sanctioned violence on Black folks and poor folks. Violence is not limited to brutality. I think that's a really important point to make, that there is violence in saturating communities with police to the point that members of that community don't feel comfortable walking to the store, walking home from the school bus. There is a certain violence in stop and frisk. It doesn't require that there is an injury, but it is violent to an entire group of people, and it's traumatic to the spirit and to the soul, one's sense of freedom and liberty. There is violence in pretrial detention, wrongful prosecution, and even prosecution that is based on facts that took place. Right? There is violence in the disproportionate impact of harsh sentencing laws and drug laws on Black and brown communities, on poor communities. The violence of incarceration, including solitary confinement, including the shackling of pregnant women and birthing people in our prisons. And then the violence of the civil death, of being stripped of your rights and privileges as you try to re-enter community, from being incarcerated, being unable to find housing, being unable to find jobs, being unable to get a driver's license. All of those things are violent and have collateral consequences that are not always addressed when we limit our conversations to just the issue of policing. And so when I talk to my criminal justice reform students and we talk about, so if we're talking about physical violence, we discuss things like what happened to George Floyd, But then also things like what happened to Ahmaud Arbery, where ordinary people who were not sworn law enforcement were not only encouraged by our current systems to pursue and to kill their community members truly by being vigilantes, but then also the state permitted the violence by not addressing it in any significant way until there was community pressure. So those are sort of the two ways that I think about state and state sanctioned violence, both through acts of physical violence, but then also through the violence of systemic oppression and the way that the system differently processes folks depending on the color of their skin or the amount of money in their bank accounts.
So, I mean, that's a huge spectrum, right? When we're thinking about and as you're framing it, the way that you started out is like when people think about it, and I think even me, my initial gut reaction when we think about state violence is, the killing of unarmed Black people. That's immediately what comes to mind. But as you're framing it, it's much broader than that, right? Like there's this spectrum that goes from this idea of liberty, right, of freedom and existence, to all the way to physical harm. And creating a space where we are able to live and exist, where we have that liberty and freedom to exist without worry, without burden, just literally breathing in everyday life, and also all the way to the other end of the spectrum where we're protected from physical harm that, again, of course, is an infringement upon that liberty. And so that spectrum is very broad. It's really long. So how do we remedy that, right? Like that, I mean, as we think about the different things that you were talking about, that's coming in from all different sectors, from all different points in the system. It seems like there are a lot of solutions that would be necessary to address all of those problems. So where do we start? How do we get to this idea of community safety when there are all these different pieces that come into play?
The way that I like to think about interventions is to begin at the beginning, right? To address where are the roots for these systems. And often we find that the public policy undergirding many of our current laws that enact violence on Black folks and poor folks, that origin is chattel slavery. And I know we can't go back and imagine that or change the fact that chattel slavery actually occurred. But when we look at the root of certain laws, for example, our citizens arrest statute in Georgia was recently used by prosecutors when they did not want to prosecute the killers of Ahmaud Arbery. Because there was a law enacted shortly after enslaved Africans were emancipated in Georgia that would essentially deputize the whole of white humanity to police and exact social control on Black people in the state of Georgia. And so during the legislative hearings around a potential repeal of citizens' arrest, James Woodall, who was the president of the Georgia NAACP, gave public testimony about the origins of our citizens' arrest statute, and that being one of the reasons that it should be repealed, right? And we have all of this data about people who are allowed to arrest others as citizens and people who aren't. But the really curious thing was when James gave his testimony, some of the legislators were furious and actually lodged allegations at him of being dishonest and not trustworthy. And he was just telling the truth, right? And so I think that through political education around how these laws came to be, it may not necessarily be the thing that we have to do to move the needle with the legislature, but it is helpful in galvanizing support among ordinary people. And so that's just one example. But when we're talking about police, this issue of police violence, I think what we saw on the 6th of January is that violence de-escalation training works just fine when the people who are being policed are considered to be sympathetic to the police, right? I'm a member of Ebenezer Baptist Church. My pastor just posted a picture of his arrest in 2017 when he was merely at the Capitol protesting what he believed to be an unjust budget. And there are pictures of him being arrested by the Capitol Police. And now that he's a sitting senator, there's also this piece of how is it that protesting a budget can get an entire group of clergy arrested while people are literally looting the Capitol after panic buttons have been removed from the offices of progressive legislators, and they're allowed to walk out of the Capitol, and not only to walk out, to largely walk out unharmed and unscathed. And so the interventions with policing, I think we have to be a little bit more honest with ourselves about whether it's a training issue or if it is a cultural issue that embraces, that is caused by embracing this idea that Black people, brown people, poor people can only be controlled if they're policed and policed violently, and that there are other people who are left to police themselves, which I believe is what we saw on the 6th of January in Washington.
So if one is to believe and to kind of follow that logic, that it is in fact a cultural issue as opposed to a training issue, right? That our cultural perspective and our cultural lens is shaped through our experiences and how we were raised and the things that we're exposed to. And so again, to kind of revisit that question, how do we change that then, right? Like, I mean, do we have the capacity to change that culture of the people who are coming in and serving on the police force or serving on the legislature that are making these decisions? What is the action that we can take to make some significant change?
I think it begins with engaging your local decision makers. There is a lot of focus on federal legislation when in fact federal legislation really can't even make a sizable dent in the issue we have with mass incarceration and state violence. And so to give you an example, I served as co-chair with my colleague and mentor, John Rapping, of Mayor Bottom's Use of Force Advisory Council that convened over a period of 45 days after the killing of Rayshard Brooks to recommend changes to the Atlanta Police Department. And that appointment was one that I was sort of skeptical about. And I was skeptical of it, but I took it because I thought that perhaps we could put our heads together and offer something beyond the status quo, beyond the 8 can't wait framework. And so what I focused on was non-law enforcement responses to harm. And this week, the city of Atlanta launched a 311 system that provides community members with an alternative to calling 911 in zones 5 and 6. And the reason that was important to us was because studies show that they demonstrate that the more saturated a community is with police, the more likely lethal force and the more likely use of force is across the board, which it follows that means it's more likely that lethal force will be used. And just highlighting whether it's lethal force against armed or unarmed people in a state with such strong Second Amendment legislation, really, it's important that we talk about how people can call someone else when their child is having a mental health episode or is dealing with addiction, that businesses can call someone other than police when maybe there's someone sleeping outside of the door, inhibiting, commerce or something like that. And so putting pressure on the city, using 311 as an example, the pressure from the beginning of 311 was the Atlanta Fulton Pre-Arrest Diversion Program, which grew out of community organizing. So many of the changes that we see across the country the ideas do not come from legislators. Those ideas come from ordinary people who have chosen to join organizations and pick up local and hyper-local causes. And so, when we started organizing around the Atlanta Citizen Review Board in 2008, with Dr. Lowry and Ms. Butler at the People's Agenda and others, I don't think we could have imagined that in 2021, we would finally be launching a resource funded by the government that allows police to take a step back. And I'm acknowledging that's not nearly enough, but taking up local causes, since policing is almost entirely controlled by local governments and their funding is almost entirely controlled by city councils and county commissions in our 159 counties, it is absolutely necessary that we engage our local elected officials to get things done, and that we listen to subject matter experts. There's so many toolkits and books available now. And in the age of COVID, there are free webinars available where congregations, mosques, synagogues, schools can just take those resources and teach their folks about how to engage on these issues so we can push forward. We need 311 in all of our zones in the city. We need pre-arrest diversion to be used by police officers, which is a program that allows cops to show up to a scene and decide to call someone to render services instead of arresting the person. We need more of that. We don't need what the city of Atlanta is currently doing, which is looking for more ways to pump dollars into policing instead of thinking about addressing the root causes of harm and the services that people need to stay out of our poverty safety net.
So I'm going to backtrack a little bit before we get into the city of Atlanta specifically. So you were contrasting and explaining this resource that we now have available through 311. You talked about you briefly mentioned 8 Can't Wait. Can you just, if you could quickly, I know it's kind of detailed, but if you can just give an idea, just so we can have an idea of the contrast of how 311 compares to other policy that's being proposed.
Sure. So 8 Can't Wait was a campaign launched this summer. Well, really, it was a narrative framing policy recommendation that really focuses on reforms to police departments like bias sensitivity training, body cameras, and other things that really were a part of recommendations coming out of the Obama administration's 21st Century Policing Advisories. And since those recommendations were popularized, what we saw through research was those kinds of those reforms that focus on the premise, or that are sort of rooted in the premise that the reason that police kill people unjustly is because they haven't been taught enough, they don't have the right equipment, they don't have to write the right kinds of reports. What we've seen is that's actually not true. We've actually seen that in some places that have spent a ton of money on body cameras, that police violence against communities actually went up. We've seen where bias sensitivity training doesn't necessarily make a big difference when it comes to the likelihood of use of force or over arresting. And so the 8 Can't Wait framework is, in my opinion, what is this, 2021? So it's several years too late. And that we really have to enact reforms that are harm reductive in nature, and that say we want to eliminate the opportunity for there to be violence. We want to start to eliminate the opportunity for over arresting, because that is what drives mass incarceration. It's not, people who have been killed are not then jailed, right? And so we've also got to address what happens to the people who did not die, and how do we address how they got there. And unfortunately, body cameras and bias sensitivity training in a vacuum that doesn't address the really racist nature of policing in many places, those things cannot be effective.
Okay, so switching gears, right? You are on the way to kind of getting into thinking about things more locally as opposed to thinking about it from the national platform. And as we think about our city, we think about Atlanta, how do we approach these issues, right? If it's not 8 Can't Wait, if it's not, the sensitivity training and those kinds of things, it seems like we're taking a step in the right direction with 311. What other things, from your perspective, should we be advocating, should we be promoting in order to achieve this idea of community safety for everybody?
Local governments have to have the courage to change the laws that are disproportionately harming marginalized communities, and to follow through with the implementation of those laws and support and other supportive policies. And when I say that, I mean, in 2018, Mayor Bottoms signed bail reform legislation into law. What that ordinance did is it said, unless someone was charged with a crime where violence was alleged or actually occurred, so violence was threatened or alleged to have occurred, those people would be released by the jailer at the city jail before they had to see a judge, with, just with the citation of when they're supposed to come back to court. Community organizations wrote the initial draft of that ordinance and passed it along to the city, where several changes were made. Well, one of the changes that were made to that ordinance was a section of that ordinance was stripped, which addressed the supportive services that people who find themselves in municipal court need in order to be successful as having their cases adjudicated. So we need people to be able to come back to court, litigate their cases, and continue to come back to court until the cases are done, right? That chapter was stripped, and community was told that it would be revisited as a second ordinance, as a later ordinance. Another resolution that passed was based on research that we made available to the city that said, when you enact bail reform legislation, you have to do something to make sure that people know that they have to come back to court and they know what resources are available to them. And at the heart of that is court notification systems. The city council passed a resolution that they would do that. There are free services that we're willing to offer text message notifications and postcards to folks to allow them to come back to court. And for years, we have been unable to get the city to have any conversations about that, and they complain about failures to appear. Well, when you fast forward a couple of years, we see rollbacks of bail reform legislation, primarily fueled by Buckhead folks who are upset about street racing. And so their bright idea was, well, let's just eliminate street racing charges. By the way, there is no statute in Georgia for this activity specifically called like street racing that addresses what city council wanted to talk about. So they came up with the idea to further criminalize this by saying, okay, well, if you get arrested for speeding, reckless driving, and a couple of other charges, then you're not eligible for a bail reform signature bond. We warned against it. The Vera Institute for Justice warned against it. And we said, this is a rollback of bail reform. It will be a slippery slope. And what you will see is that bail reform will be the thing that you pick at every time you have a problem about crime in the city. The complementary ordinance that was passed, or resolution that was passed by the city, was to authorize the task force to reimagine the Atlanta City Detention Center, which is, referred to as a city jail closure. That jail was operating at a budget of $33 million a year. It was built it was the first building erected in anticipation of the 1996 Olympic Games. And we believe that it was erected because it was a place to hide poor people and homeless people during the Olympics. After the Olympics, the jail was never at capacity, and the city began to take on ICE detainees. Marilyn Wynn is an organizer in Atlanta who had been sent to prison 7 times. And her 7th time she got out, and she said that the reason that she was able to stay out of prison that time is because the judge gave her services instead of a harsh sentence. She started an organization called Women on the Rise, and their campaign was to close down the city jail. Hundreds of hours spent, and the reasons that we wanted to do both of these things is because pretrial incarceration is violent. It deprives our communities of people and the ability to take care of our families, and it has a racially disproportionate impact. So bail and then the jail goes with that. Well, now, as we had a summer of uprisings, the Atlanta City Council has decided that they no longer want to commit to closing the jail. One figure from the Vera Institute is that it has cost the city $807,000 per person per year to house someone at that city jail. And so when I say that local legislatures have to be willing to stay the course, they are sort of trending toward what people were doing in 1994, which is because some violent crime, categories of violent crime are up in Atlanta. And though the city jail only housed people accused of municipal court code violations, pedestrian in the roadway, disorderly conduct, public urination, these sorts of things are where people are at the city jail for. This isn't felonies, this isn't violent crimes. And despite the fact that people who got bail reform signature bonds were not accused of violent crime, they are using these two reforms as scapegoats when thinking about the national trend of an uptick in violent crime during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so if they do not sort of reverse course, we are confident that we will see another surge in police violence in the city. Crime is down in most categories in Atlanta, but the easy targets are always Black folks, brown folks, and poor folks. And it doesn't matter who the legislator is. We have a largely Black city council. Our city leadership is representative of what Atlanta looks like. And some might argue may overrepresent what Atlanta looks like when it comes to Black folks. But the idea that incarcerating and policing Black people makes the whole safer is again theory that comes directly from chattel slavery, Black codes, and Jim Crow. And so we are during a time when places like Minneapolis, Seattle, Portland, even Illinois are moving toward more and more progressive policies. Almost with the exception of 311, the city of Atlanta is being led by fear tactics that are going to cause more harm in our communities.
So, there was a lot there, right? there was a lot there. But what I noticed was this common thread or idea of the feeling of safety, right? And you and I actually, we had a conversation about this and what that means, and it means different things to different people. And in that conversation that you and I had, we talked about how for some, the presence of police in and of itself gives a feeling of safety, right? It makes me feel more comfortable. I see the police are here. If something happens, I feel as if I'm protected. Whereas for others, due to their experiences, their lived experiences, the experiences of those around them, the presence of police feels like a threat to their safety. But the common theme in what I just heard you discussing was this notion that, the use of, jailing, the reluctance for bail reform, the constant issues that seem to be coming is this notion of the presence of police equating to safety. And I guess my question for that is, is there something to be said, or does that count for something? Like if it makes us feel more safe to have a greater police presence, to have, a heavy reliance on jails, in the context of someone being charged for something and not necessarily having the ability to, to bail out. Is that something that should be a part of the conversation? Like, should that liberty for those that feel safer around the presence of police, like, should that be part of the conversation as well? Or is it that the liberty of those others, in the context of not being policed, outweighs that? Like, how do we strike a balance with those two competing interests, I guess, is the question.
Sure. I tend to hope that at some point we can look at the concrete harm caused by this reliance on policing and incarceration. And we can see that in places like our school budgets. We can see schools across the country, even in the city of Atlanta, in the state of Georgia, being funded less and less every year. And police budgets almost without exception either remain the same or grow every single year. And since the mid 80s, this has been the trend. And it's been the trend despite reports from people like folks at the Vera Institute that said after about 1984, there was a diminishing return on incarceration, that that the 4 to 25% decrease in property crime only. Incarceration, there is no correlation that is reliable that links the incarceration rates to a decrease in violent crime, right? But in property crime, that after a period of time, years ago, any return continues to diminish. But we see our classroom sizes, our school to teacher ratio getting worse and worse. We see public health almost being entirely defunded. And so we are so comfortable with saying that the market gets to dictate what we have in other areas of our public life. The market dictates what's available to us when we're talking about waste management. The market gets to dictate what happens when we're talking about watershed management. The market gets to dictate what happens when we're talking about early childhood education and public education, when we're talking about public colleges. And so in every other category, when the economy suffers, those industries and areas of public life receive less and less money. The Atlanta police budget is almost $250 million. And in the middle of the uprisings, the city offered bonuses to police officers because their morale was low and they didn't want to return to work because of the indictments of the officers in Ray Sharpbrooks and the Mayor Strong statements regarding police brutality. And, we really need to think about, what does it say about us that we are willing to rob literally everyone else? Our children, our seniors, those suffering with mental health disabilities, those unable to afford health care. What does it say about us that we are pouring money into policing and incarceration when there is not a documented reason? There's no data supporting a return on that. And so my daughter doesn't actually feel safer when she sees police. She sort of panics. And you might think that it's because of the kind of work that I do, but it's because one day, one of my family members took her to a skate party and his insurance had lapsed, and she was in the back seat and it was chilly outside, and they stopped him and he asked whether he could just be allowed to drive the car home, or whether they could wait a moment so that there would be somewhere for her to be. And instead they took the car, and there's discretion there, right? You could take his license. There are a lot of things that can happen. And so my daughter, being a middle class Black girl that goes to private school, also doesn't feel safer around police. But even if she did, if we legislate our feelings, legislating feelings is sort of how we got into this mess. And at some point, our decision makers have to have the courage to say that they will legislate based on what results they actually have cause to believe they will get, instead of legislating to win elections and legislating because people are afraid of Black people. If we, especially as Black people, continue to capitalize on the fear that has been ingrained in folks in this country, in the world, in fact, to fear Black people, then shame on us, because so much of this tough on crime, it is documented what Nixon meant by tough on crime now. If we continue down this path, then we have in part ourselves to blame for the way that this will impact future generations.
So then that naturally goes to, this big question, or this big concept of defunding or divesting the police departments. You mentioned that the budget for the for the police is about $250 million. How does that, so just, I guess, two questions, and then after this question, we'll open it to the audience for other questions. But one, how does that compare? And I don't know if you know at the top of your head, but statistically to other public services in the context of police, like how much of the budget are they getting? And then outside of that question, just what is the idea of it, quickly, what is the idea of defunding or divesting from the police? What does that look like? Because I know there's a lot of talk about, it being a very radical idea that means we will be living in a chaotic society that's lawless and doesn't necessarily have the parameters in place to keep us safe. So if you could just really speak to exactly what it is and what it would mean for Atlanta before we open to the audience.
Absolutely. And I'm going to paste a handy dandy link. So the Vera Institute for Justice, and I'm citing them because they're one of the best data shops for this stuff, has a website with most major cities. You can type it in and you can see the data for your police department. In Atlanta, the policing accounts for 30% of our annual budget. We have our ratio is 1 police officer for every 209 inhabitants of this city. Comparing that to Boston, Boston is 1 in every 229, and Charlotte is 1 in every 349. So even when we're talking about comparable cities, Atlanta's officer to citizen ratio is a little bit higher. And despite that, since I've been doing this work, there has always been a call for more officers to be hired. And even in recent conversations in the AJC about policing, what we're talking about, we've been talking about this for a decade. Officer morale and low employment in the police department are not having enough officers within APD, when statistically it looks like we have enough. The idea of defunding the police is no different than when we talk about we used to talk about it and call it divest, invest. It's about building up funding for the areas that we know will keep people out of the crosshairs of the criminal legal system, while simultaneously knocking down these bloated police budgets. Because with the rise of mass incarceration after the 1994 crime bill, which caused most of the 50 states to then enact local state legislation that mirrored the provisions of the 94 crime bill, police budgets continue to grow, and we continue to suffer in other areas, which I mentioned. And so that Vera tool is really good. Also, the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute has a really handy tool where you can look up most cities in Georgia and get a snapshot of the spending within that city's department as compared to other services. But policing accounts for 30% of Atlanta's budget.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that wrap up. So now I want to turn it over to the audience and see if you all have any questions for Tiffany. And I already got one question, which was if you could explain again 311 and how that came about.
Sure. So in 2000, I think I want to say 16. The city launched a public-private partnership called Atlanta Fulton County Pre-Arrest Diversion Program. And that grew out of an organization, a grassroots organization called Building Locally to Organize for Community Safety Blocks. And that later spawned a couple of other organizations, Racial Justice Action Center and Solutions and Not Punishment Coalition. And our fight was because there were city council people that wanted to literally banish sex workers from the city once they had a certain number of convictions. And so we started to talk about a program called SOAP and LEAD in Seattle that provided services to people who were being arrested for sex work, for addiction, for mental health disabilities. And what we came up with was something a little bit better, which it doesn't require an arrest. So it's pre-arrest diversion allows a police officer to call a care navigator at this office that is a partnership between Fulton and Atlanta. So it includes law enforcement and prosecutors, along with the public defender's office and service providers. They call a care navigator. They have a little yellow retired taxi that they come and they bring and they sit and they sort of do an intake with a person who would otherwise be arrested. It's a housing first model. They give them immediate housing. And then they figure out what other supportive services they need. Often these people have other open cases, families, and all these things to consider. Well, the idea with PAD became, how can we make these services available to people who maybe there isn't probable cause to arrest? And so 311 allows not just police officers to divert people from the criminal legal system. It allows ordinary people to do it. So you call 311. It launched today. I think today was the launch date. You call 311 and you describe the problem. It goes to a dispatch just like 911 would, and they will send out a responder that is not a police officer if they determine that the call meets the criteria. That is a budget allocation that, if made more robust, could be a perfect example of investing in services and care and divesting from policing. Because the issue with PAD was officers really weren't using it as much as they could, because they still were relying so heavily on arrest. So how do we do that? We also give power to communities to make some decisions about who is responding to the crises that they are having, because often people want someone. There are so many mothers whose children have been jailed or killed because they were having mental health crises. They were in crisis, and police came and there was harm. And so communities want another example. There's a program in Eugene, Oregon called Cahoots. It's sort of it's like 311, but it was started by a community organization, and it's been adopted. And in places where non-law enforcement emergency response has been enabled, we have seen a decrease in crime and not an increase in crime.
And it just, out of curiosity in terms of how that works, if, it's a new program, right? 311. So many people obviously don't know about it. Is there a mechanism in place if I call 911, if I call for law enforcement, that this is now routed to 311 as being what should be a non-law enforcement call? Or is there something to kind of catch that go between? Because I imagine there was a lag, in its existence and people knowing that it actually exists and actually using it.
Yes. So one of the things I think that they spent a lot of time on was the coding issue. And so I don't know the particulars of how the city is handling the coding, but different kinds of crises already have different codes. And the way that it works is certain codes for incidents are eligible for 311. So it's possible for some of those things to be diverted as well. And I'm pasting the link for the pre-arrest diversion initiative, which should have some information about 311, and I'll also try to paste information about Atlanta 311.
Okay, we have another question asking, what are some examples outside of 311 of divest and invest that have worked in other places?
Another example of divest invest practically is the police free schools campaigns across the country. School resource officers are extremely expensive, and here are some cities that have pulled school resource officers out of schools at a savings of $17 million. Minneapolis, Milwaukee, Hopkins, East Lansing, San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose, Rochester, Portland, Denver, Seattle, and they're at Charlottesville, Portland, DC. So there are a lot of places that where they weren't allowing schools to have nurses and counselors, but they had a resource officer. And resource officers don't yield better safety outcomes for students. A lot of people think that resource officers prevent school shootings. I think we have seen enough coverage of that to know that that's not necessarily the case, or that's not the case at all. And so that's another, the Police Free Schools Initiative is Appleseed, the Advancement Project, and several other allies help to run a coalition for that initiative. And there are some southern cities, like, for example, in North Carolina, that have taken up these campaigns. That's an example of divest, invest, so that those dollars can go into the schools to provide services that young people actually need to be successful in their educational experience.
Okay, thank you. So another question, since conservative politicians have demonized the defund the police slogan and demand. How do we change the narrative? Good question.
Can you read that one?
Since conservative politicians have demonized the defund the police slogan and demand, how do we change the narrative, right? So how do we shift how that's being seen and understood by the public, and whether people are buying into it?
Yeah, so this one comes up a lot, and I just want to remind folks that before conservatives demonized defund the police, they demonized Black Lives Matter. That's how we got Blue Lives Matter. And it's only been through sort of like the robust co-optation by capitalist or corporations that Black Lives Matter is now something you can see, rolling across your screen when you're watching, CNBC or something. But there has never been an instance to which I can point that a slogan intended to empower disaffected and marginalized people has not then been demonized by those who would rather keep them marginalized. And so some are shifting the narrative. The question is, how do we engage in political education in such a way where when challenged, our folks know what to say? Because, again, they have been defunding our schools. The government has been defunding our schools for decades. And we think it's okay. We talk about blue lives. Well, what color is a teacher's life? What color is a healthcare worker's life? The question should be, why is it that we want to race to appease people who, whether it was for saying Black power, whether it was saying that Black people should be emancipated from slavery, whether it was saying that we should be afforded the right to vote and not have to count jelly beans in a jar, no matter what we said. I mean, I have deacons at my church who talk to me about their parents paying poll taxes for other people in their communities during a time when that was very dangerous. And so I think what has to be at the forefront is political education and being honest with conservatives, or not even conservatives, people who oppose funding communities in a way that makes them safer, need to be confronted with the reality that they have never wanted to enact policies that dismantle the codification of white supremacy in our country. That's just the fact of the matter. And to demonize organizers and visionary young people is a misstep. They demonize SNCC, they demonize the Black Panther Party. So why would we appease those who are demonizing our brightest minds?
We have a great follow-up question to that one. And that's, is there an opportunity to negotiate, and along these lines of thinking about what that looks like and shifting the perspective, is there an opportunity to negotiate more accountability for officers when the city renews its contract with the APD union? There's a comment after it that says, we're often distracted by firing the police chief instead of dealing with the culture driven by the union.
Yes, I would say so. Atlanta is a rare city where the relationship between the police union and the council doesn't really look like it looks in other cities. So what I would encourage you to do is to look at the 45-day recommendations of the Use of Force Advisory Council. There are several recommendations that get at accountability for police officers, but also the ways that the Atlanta Police Department and others incentivize bad behavior. Unless it's changed, there was a system in place that gave officers additional points depending on what kinds of arrests they made, multipliers. So if you made a felony arrest, that point was multiplied by 5. If you made a misdemeanor arrest, that arrest was multiplied by 3. A traffic citation multiplied by 1.5. Arresting a child multiplied by 5. But if you report to a scene, you don't arrest someone because you decide that there's no reason to do that, then you are penalized because that is multiplied by 0.25, right? So you lose points if you don't arrest a person. And so directly from officers, we have heard that there are penalties for your points not being where they needed to be. Your beat would be changed. Maybe your ability to do off-duty jobs, right, was taken away from you, which is income. And so we also address that need, the need to disincentivize bad behavior. We should not be incentivized over arrests without cause. We should encourage people to have discretion and to say, I don't want to take this mother out of her home, so I'm not going to arrest the person. If officers were not incentivized to arrest, maybe they would have let Rayshard Brooks' sister come and pick him up less than a mile from her home. And so I would say, read the 45-day recommendations and then call your council member and tell them that they need to enact legislation to adopt our recommendations, because many of those cannot be done by executive order. And right now their focus is on how to arrest more people so that we feel safer without actually making us safer.
So within that, I think what comes to mind is the negotiating power inherent in police unions, right? And one of the questions we have is, how do we address the role of police unions in police policy?
In many cities, that is the case. Atlanta, we have a police foundation that does a lot of the organizing, but the union relationship isn't as strong. In Atlanta, most of the time, the police unions' roles are to assist officers who claim they're wrongfully terminated or who are going through internal affairs investigations. But the brokering power really in Atlanta is between the council and directly with the mayor. Because we have a strong mayor charter where the mayor makes most of the policy for police, because police fall under the executive in Atlanta, unlike other cities where policing may fall under council or commissions. And so the negotiating power is really with the community and the mayor, and then the community and council for matters that the mayor can't control. The mayor can control every standard operating procedure that APD has.
And so if the power is with the people, all right, if there's one area you'd recommend listeners to focus their energy and organize on, what would that area be?
Any arrest quotas, and so eliminating any performance evaluation system that even resembles an arrest quota, and incentivizing diversion, pre-arrest diversion. Those are two things that are in our recommendations that the city can take action on right now.
Okay. There's a question. This question is pretty specific. It says, but I think it's really important. The person says, I work for a nonprofit in Zone 1. We were told that there were only 6 officers assigned to the entire area, and there were no specialized units. What can we do, or what types of resources can we tap into when the population we serve are involved in or victims of crimes, and there's no police officer available to respond?
So that Zone 1 is like West Side, right? Bankhead, and it is in transition or being gentrified, however you'd like to put it. I would say if there, and I think what you're saying is there are only 6 officers on the beat at any given time patrolling. And if you have public safety issues, one resource now, if it's not one that you believe would lead to violence, is well, I don't want to encourage you to call the police for those things, but to ask that one of the next zones that benefits from 311 would be Zone 1. Zone 1 is, there are parts of Zone 1 where you can have officers to do pre-arrest diversion. And then a big piece of this is like what I do with my Southern Center hat is try to identify places that could use additional resources for programming that would lend itself to public safety or to community safety. There are these At Promise centers, and I know the Police Athletic League also is involved. So there are some sort of police-led community center type of initiatives to address children on the margins. But, you know, we are interested in funding and supporting programs like you've heard of Books and Breakfast, things that would give young people a place to go. So I'm happy if you'd like to just contact me directly. We work with some organizers in Zone 1 around the killing of DeAndre Phillips, who was the young man who was killed in the parking lot of the Atlanta Police Department Public Safety Annex some years ago, and his family. And we know that there is a desire in Zone 1 to do more organizing and preventative care and violence de-escalation trainings. There are organizations like Gangsters to Growers and Street Groomers that have like sort of grassroots violence de-escalation practices and trainings, but we know that more of that is necessary. But I would be happy to look into this question of the resources that Atlanta is currently making available to Zone 1. I just can't speak to that. I'm not as knowledgeable about those numbers as I should be.
Okay. Thank you. Can you, Tiffany, put your preferred contact information in the chat for those who may?
I sure can.
Yeah. And then we have, it looks like this may be our final question from the audience, which is kind of like, what exactly is your call to action? Are you calling for defunding as a step to police and prison abolition? Why or why not?
So I am, with my, Tiffany hat on, a prison police abolitionist. And I understand that may be far down the line, but I do believe, so if you think about it, America incarcerates 25% of the world's prisoners, 25%. And we claim to be the leader of the free world. And there's irony in that. And so the reason that I believe funding community resources is necessary is because you can't tear anything down without building up something to replace it. And so it's necessary that we're honest with ourselves and say some reforms are necessary in the interim, as long as those reforms don't reinforce systems of oppression. So, for example, we won't champion any legislation that would cause e-carceration, so the electronic incarceration of people, to become hardened as a fixture in American culture, because we want prison sentences to go down. We've got to figure out how to reduce the population of people under correctional control. And so I believe that adequately funding communities is an imperative step for anyone who believes in abolition, and it is an imperative step for anyone that believes in public safety. Georgia right now has had the title for years of being the state with the most people under correctional control. We have more people in jail, in prison, on probation and parole than any other state in this country. And so we've got to address that, and we can't address that without adequately funding communities. And the most bloated budgets that we see are that of police budgets.
That's a nice way to wrap up. And I just want to bring us back to the idea, of where we started, abolishing state violence in an effort to reshape or reimagine our idea of community safety, and kind of calling everybody to remember what that community safety looks like. And I think we kind of touched on that in a few different ways throughout the conversation, but being mindful of what safety means for different people in different spaces, and what liberty means for different people in different places, and just being mindful that existence in that space is something that we should all be striving for everyone to have, right? That sense of peace, that sense of freedom, and that sense of liberty. So I thank you, Tiffany. I learned a lot, as always, talking with you. And I mean, you dropped a lot of gems. I'm sure a lot of us after this are going to research quite a few things to kind of follow up and learn some more information. She has included her information in the chat for anybody who wants to reach out to her otherwise. But thank you so much for joining us. And that concludes the program for us tonight. Thanks, Tiffany.
Thank you, Kenda.
And I just want to announce, I think I might need to get some clarity on the next Freedom School series is on January 27th. We have some fellow named Akinyele Omoja who's going to be talking about 40 Acres and Beyond, the history of the reparations movement in the United States. So come back for that. But I just want to applaud Attorney Roberts and Attorney Professor Abdus-Saboor on this excellent conversation. I learned a whole lot. I'm taking some copious notes on all the information that was dropped. I mean, this is something I think that a lot of our faculty, I'm talking not just talking about African American studies, I'm talking about across the university. You drop so much information, and I think based upon who you are, what type of work you do, and of course, Professor Abdus-Saboor was excellent in asking and moving you along in this conversation. So I applaud both of you, and just hope that it's circulated and that we have you do this again, because again, it was so much pertinent information that I think is necessary for us to be able to answer the questions to our students. And I'm speaking now as a faculty member and as a professor, but and of course our students need to know this information. We all, if we want to make some serious changes, we got to be informed. And you are definitely drop some wisdom and knowledge and know-how on us today. So thank you. I want to thank both of you. And we want to invite folk to come back the rest of the semester. Make sure you stay tuned if you're not on Auburn Avenue Research Library's Facebook page. Also be on the Department of African American Studies. Did I say research page? Their Facebook page, if you're on Facebook, and just stay plugged in and share the information with others once you get it. Thanks again to our panelists, our hosts for this night, and we'll talk to you next Wednesday on the 27th. Thanks a lot. Stay strong, and I'll say free the land.